Have you ever found yourself at the right place at the exact right time before? We were going to a theme park in Indiana when we lived up there called Holiday World, and just like any theme park, it is expensive to go. There's 5 of us, and so it was going to be expensive. And so as we were walking up to the counter, credit card in hand to take the punch in the gut, all of a sudden we were approached. There was a whole group of Boy Scouts that was going to Holiday World, and they're counting up their numbers and they're counting up their tickets, and they had 5 extra tickets. Right as I was walking up, and the guy turns around and he says, "Hey, would you like these for free?" And I said, "I would love those for free. Thank you very much. Exact right place at the right time." Unfortunately, later that day, some other kids would find themselves at the exact wrong place at the exact wrong time. My kids were younger then, and Major, my youngest one, he was too little to go on some of the bigger rides. It was a theme park and a water park in one. And so I told Logan, my wife, and my older 2 kids, I said, "You guys go ride some rides. I'll take Major to the little kiddie pool, and we'll do that." Well, we got there, and there was a little bitty water slide there, and he loved it, right? And so I would go up to the top of the water slide, hold him there, and then release him, and he would go down. He loved it so much that he just kept going. He would not stop. He would not take a break from that. In fact, he loved it so much that he would not stop when he felt like he had to go to the bathroom. And I set him up there, and I set him on that slide, and the water's running down, and all of a sudden I see that the water's not as clear as it once was, and that it has a little brown tint to it. and then it became much richer brown, and so those poor kids down there, wrong place, wrong time, so we got out of there in no time. I love the text today, what we're going through. You guys know that we're in the middle of a series called Curveball, and it's the story through Genesis, and we're in Genesis chapter 41, and if you were here last week, you know that Joseph, he was in the pit. He was in the prison for something that he didn't even do. He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time, and now he finds himself in the pit for 10 years. 10 years he's there. But now, chapter 41, we see that God is going to bring him out of the pit, and he's going to be at the right place at the right time. So if you got your Bibles, open them up to Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. We'll start there in verse 1. If you don't, you can check out the screens we got up here, or there's Bibles in front of you there. So Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. It says, "When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream." 2 full years. What is it talking about? Well, again, if you were here last week, you know that Joseph was in prison for most of a decade. And then these 2 guys had a dream. They were there, and then Joseph interprets this dream while they're in prison, and one of them gets out, and the one that gets out, the cupbearer, was supposed to turn around and help Joseph get out. But what did the text say? That he forgot him. For 2 years, he forgot him. And so, man, I just want to take a pause right now and just say, listen, if you find yourself in the pit, like what we talked about last week, if you are in a spot in your life where you're struggling, I just want to remind you and encourage you that it will pass. Eventually, it will pass. It might be longer than what you hoped. It might be tougher than you expected, but it will pass. And so it says, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Now, I'm going to read this text, and I got to give a little bit of a disclaimer here. Last week, I read the entire chapter, and so I felt like I had to kind of read it fast last week. So after this, I preached a sermon. Several people came up to me last week, and they were like, "Man, that was great. Your sermon hit. It was just fantastic. Giving me pats on the back. Well, I got home, and Logan, my wife, she gives it straight, and she said, "Listen, When you read the text last week, that was terrible. You put the pauses in the wrong places. It sounds like you didn't even practice reading the Bible out loud ever before. You put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllables, and so try to do better next week. So, let me see if I can measure up to Logan's standards here. So here we go. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. Okay, hold on to that. Remember that. They grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows were ugly and gaunt. And the cows that, oh gosh, I'm already messing up. Logan. All right. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. And Pharaoh woke up, and it had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent off for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Remember that, all of them. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then, this is where you can almost hear the head slap in the text right here. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Oh my goodness." He said, "I forgot. Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings." Right there, he's like, "Oh my gosh. I know a guy." There was a guy when I was in prison, and I had a dream, and he interpreted it, and it happened just exactly the way that it did, and that he said it would. There's a guy that can interpret your dream. I totally forgot about that. Man, have you ever forgotten something crucial before? I hate that. The things that I forget the most are meetings whenever I'm supposed to be there, and you get that dreaded text, "Are you about here?" Oh gosh, I haven't had one of those in a while, so hopefully that doesn't happen. But last week, I don't know if you noticed, but last week I forgot to download my sermon. You guys know I like to put my sermon on an iPad, and I forgot to put it on there. I walked up with no sermon. And I realized it as I was walking up. Julie Lewis was up here, and she was talking about her Go Life Ministries, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have my sermon. This is going to be the shortest sermon of all time, you know. And of course, Logan was like, praise God, you know. So I don't know if you noticed, but Julie was up here, and I introduced her, and she was talking, and I kind of like slid off stage, and then I went and I ran into my office, and I was like downloading the sermon, you know, and everything from my computer to my iPad, and then I kind of slyly, you know, just kind of came back up here, and I asked Julie later, I said, "Hey, were you just terrified that I just left you up there all alone?" She said, "I didn't even know you left." I said, "Yeah, I'm a real magician. I just kind of disappear from one side of the stage and just reappear over here, you know." But he forgets something not trivial, but this is crucial. I mean, think about it. I don't know if I buy this. Think about this. What is the most crazy story of the cupbearer's life? It's this, you know? Like, how many people is he telling about? Like, oh my gosh, I was in prison. I had a dream. You know, he's telling everybody about this. So I'm not saying that he didn't forget. I think he did. But I think what probably happened is he forgot when he was in the presence of Pharaoh. All right? You know, it probably never came up when he was in Pharaoh's presence, because what's his job as a cupbearer? His job is to taste the cup and make sure there's nobody's poisoned him. His life is on the line every time he's going to his work. You know, every 8 a.m. he punches his time card, and his life is risked. So he's probably not thinking about that. So he forgets. He remembers all of a sudden. He says, "Oh my gosh, there's a guy, right? There's a guy." Well, he brings it up to him, and so Pharaoh said, okay, well, get this guy, right? So Joseph, they bring him up, they clean him up, they give him a shave, and they wash his hair, and they set him out in front of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, I had a dream, right? And he says, can you interpret this? And so look in chapter 41, verse 15 and 16. He says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one could interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And he says, I cannot. What a surprise there. They said you could. And he said, no, I can't. I cannot do it. And Joseph replied, but God will. But God will give Pharaoh the answer that he desires. Man, a decade of being in the pit, not hearing from God, from being someplace that he was falsely accused of, a decade. And this guy still has held on to his faith. That's why this guy is my hero. Because we have all been in the pit before. And man, we question God. We say, man, God, what are you doing? Are you even there? I don't like this. And sometimes we say, I don't like you. And here Joseph is. This is why he's in this story. Because a decade later, he still has firm faith in God. So Pharaoh tells him his dream, and he tells him about the 7 sleek and fat cows, and then the 7 scrawny and ugly cows, and then the second dream of the 7 full heads of grain, and then the 7 thin heads of grain. And so then look in verse 25 at what it says there. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are the 7 years, and the 7 heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all of the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows, it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in the 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. There's something very interesting that happens here as Joseph interprets the dream. In the last chapter, 2 guys had a dream in prison, right? But they said they couldn't understand the meaning. If you go back and read it, they said, we don't know what it means, because no one is here to let us know. No one is here to tell us. It's insinuating that if there was some wise men here or some magicians here, then we could know. Well, here, where are the wise men and where are the magicians? They're here. They're in attendance. They're all here. And so he says, no one could answer it. This is a big deal, right? That all of them are here and they couldn't understand it. Well, Joseph says that he can't interpret the dream, but that God could. And then it's interesting because he understands the interpretation immediately. Do you guys remember? Let's go forward to the book of Daniel. Do you remember the story of Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and he says, nobody could interpret the dream. And he says, I'm going to kill everybody. He goes a step further and he said, I'm just going to kill you guys all. If you guys can't interpret the dream, what good are you to me? I'm going to kill you all. Well, Daniel was one of those wise men. And he says, can I have a shot? And so he goes home and he prays to God, God, please give me the interpretation of this dream. He goes to sleep, and then God gives it in a vision that night in a dream of his own, and he gets the dream, the interpretation of the dream. So the next day he goes and he interprets the dream. God gave him the interpretation of the dream. But here, Joseph just immediately knows the dream. Why? What's going on here? I think God still helped him, no doubt about this. But Joseph has heard this before. There's certain details in this dream that's been in his family's life already. If you look at the dream, if you know what the number 7 is, right? If you know that 7 is years, then the dream kind of interprets itself. You got 7 good cows, 7 good years, right? And then 7 bad. 7 good years, then 7 bad years, right? So if you know what the number 7 is, you kind of know what the dream is. And Joseph, he might have understood that. Now, the first thing that is said, I told you guys to remember the reeds part, where the cows were grazing amongst the reeds, right? That's interesting because the root Hebrew word for reeds is the word brothers. Brothers. So there's a lot of brothers there, and then the cows are amongst the brothers. And who was it that put him in this spot? It was his brothers. And so that by itself is not, a big deal. But just hold on to that because these are going to start stacking up. So he says there's these cows, these 7 years that come out of the brothers, right? And then when in, we're going to go to Sunday school here, see if you know this. When in this family story was 7 years a big part of their story? If you remember, Joseph's dad, Jacob, remember? And you remember whenever he wanted to marry Rachel's dad, Laban, said, you can marry her, but what's it going to cost you? You guys remember? You need to work for me for 7 years. Now, he actually had 2 daughters. He had a beautiful one, and I don't want to be crass, but an ugly one. Okay? And so what happens is, again, hey, this is not me, okay? And we're not saying that these girls are the cows, okay? We're not saying this, but look at what the text says here. When Jacob goes to marry Rachel on his wedding night, Laban, he has worked for him for 7 years. And in that time, Leah never got married. And so Laban's like, I don't know if she's ever going to get married, right? And so he gets nervous, and so he tricks Jacob that night, disguises his other daughter, and he sends Leah, right, his other daughter, in the bedroom with Jacob that night. Of course, in the morning, he's like, yo, what? I mean, you know what I'm saying? What a surprise. And so then he comes out and confronts Laban, and he says, hey, what in the world? And he goes, hey, look, I had to do this. You know, there's more to that story there. You can go read it. But he's like, I had to do this to protect Leah. And so he said, well, I don't like Leah. I want Rachel. And so he said, you can have Rachel, but you got to work for the good one. You got to work how many more years? 7 more years. So the 7 was connected to years for the bad and then the good. And in the text, if you look at the words, the Hebrew words for beautiful, the 7 sleek cows, that word is the same exact Hebrew word that it used to describe Rachel. Raphat Marah. Same words. And then if you look in the text at the words that are used to describe the ugly in form, it's the same idea. And so it's possible that Joseph is looking at this dream that Pharaoh had that's going to be about Pharaoh and Egypt, and he's also saying, whoa, I've seen this before. And it's interesting because the dream, as it goes on, is going to be just as much about Joseph and his family as it is about Egypt and the Egyptians. And he's going to start to see some of these things. And I think over the next days and weeks and months and even years, he's going to start to see this dream play out in his own life. Now, I'm sure that God made it plain to him. I'm sure that God did help him interpret this dream. But Joseph is seeing, and as he says this dream, he's seeing this in the mirror. And he interprets the dream. Now look what happens in verse 33. It says in verse 33, it says, and now let Pharaoh. Now listen, Joseph should have been done talking, right? What did he ask Joseph to do? interpret the dream. He did not ask him to do anything else. But Joseph keeps going. And in verse 33, he says, "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and a wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt." I wonder who that could be. You got all your discerning and wise men over there, and they can't interpret a dream. I, your humble servant, did. And so this is his way of kind of slyly, I guess, turning in his resume for the job. He's applying for this job. He says, look for somebody that's wise and put him in charge. Now, he goes on to say that this guy should store up grain for the good years so that you have enough for the bad years. Now, I just want to pause right here and just say, like, this is bold. This is a bold thing for him to do, because just yesterday, just that morning, he was a prisoner in the pit. And now he's giving government advice to Pharaoh. This is a bit of a risk, because the guys in power don't like to be told what to do, right? They like to be the ones telling other people what to do. And Pharaoh didn't ask for his advice. He only asked him to interpret the dream. So this is bold, and I'm sure Pharaoh can see through Joseph's humble job application here. Now, there's a pastor, and his name is Marty Solomon, and he would say this, that this right here, in verse 33, this right here is why God called this family to this mission. That this right here is why that God never gave up on this family. If you go back to his great-grandfather, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then Joseph, right? If you go all the way back to Abraham, you see that God had called this family to be a blessing to the whole world, to all nations, to all the people there. But the problem is that they were not always a blessing. Almost immediately, Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and even Joseph, they all get sideways. And they all start making messes almost everywhere they are. In their families are a mess. If you read this story, you're going to find some really awkward, some really gross stuff that happened with this family that God has called to bless other people. One of the lowlights in chapter 34 is whenever God had called Abraham to be a blessing. In chapter 34, one of Jacob's, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, now one of Jacob's daughters, she gets raped in a town named Shechem. So Jacob's brothers, they go and they trick all the men in that town, and they kill them all. They slaughter every single man in that town of Shechem. And then they take all their plunder, all their cattle, all their wealth, and they carry it off. And they even carry off all the women and the children. What's interesting about where that happened in Shechem, God called Abraham to this mission that I want you to be a blessing to all nations. Take a wild guess where that was that he called him. In Shechem. And you don't see Shechem mentioned again until right there in chapter 34, where their family is not being a blessing. They made messes. I want to tell you something. If you, like I said last week, man, if you're looking at your own family and saying, "Whoa, man, we are messed up," man, just take encouragement right here. You're probably not this bad, okay? And God never gave up on them. Even Joseph, right? Probably one of the best of the lot. Right? Even he made a mess whenever he was favored, and he shoved it in the faces of his brothers with the dreams that he said that he had, and he told them the dreams. Why did God never give up on this family? It was because of this in verse 33. They would continue to see the story that they were walking into, and it wasn't always good. It wasn't always great, but they refused to sit there and do nothing about it. They would always see what they were walking into, and they had the audacity, the chutzpah, if you will, to get up and boldly, in the face of adversity, do something about it. This family, that would mark this family. That would be an identifying mark about this family. and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I mean, Jacob, if you look at Jacob and who he was, over and over, you're going to see that they would just not stay still. And even Jacob, you remember whenever he got into a wrestling match with God, and he wrestled God all night long, and he would not let him go, and God had to finally injure his hip so that he would chill out and stop. I mean, Jacob was one of those guys that just would not quit. And then he passed it right down to Joseph. He has been in prison for 10 years. And the moment that he sees an opportunity to do something good for people, he then takes that opportunity. And he speaks up again to Pharaoh. I love that. And the question for us is, why are you where you are? There may be a list of reasons. Maybe you're in a good place. Maybe you're in a bad place. Maybe other people have put you in that bad place. Maybe you've put yourself in a bad place. Maybe you're in a good place. Maybe somebody else blessed you. Maybe you blessed yourself. But for whatever reason that you are where you are, there is no accident that you have the relationships that you have. It's no accident that you have the influence that you have. It's no accident that you live where you live or you work where you work, because God wants to use you where you are to influence others. Because no matter how you got to where you are, God wants to take that and use that. Now, the rest of the story goes really, really well for Joseph. He gets the job. He gets promoted. And he becomes the most powerful man in all of Egypt next to Pharaoh himself. So you take that story and you start thinking about, how does this apply to our lives? How do we take something like this and lay it over our lives? And I would just say this. Number one, God prepares us in the waiting. You know, Joseph's time in prison, 10 years in prison, it was not wasted. The time in the pit was not a waste. Let me tell you something. God never wastes pain. He uses that to shape us and then to even help someone else later. That time in the pit, it shaped his character and prepared him to step into the role that God had for him. He was not ready yet for this powerful role. It wasn't the right time. And it wasn't the right place yet. In every great story, notice this, in every great story, God always has people walk through a time of testing. Every single time. Rick Warren said, a refinement comes before a new assignment. We need grit to be able to hold on in those times of waiting, in those times of pain. We need the grit, the spiritual grit to be able to hold on. I had two youth group kids in my youth group in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and we were doing an event I love to do. It was called a high school lake day, and we would get all our high school students at a lake, and we'd get people that own boats, and we'd go out there and inner tube. And I had two kids there, and they were Matt Majors and Tolliver Tanner. And they were on the inner tube, and they were being pulled by a guy named Wade Guerin. And Wade Guerin, he was pulling them pretty hard. He was trying to get them to roll off, right? Well, they hit some bumps, and Matt Majors, he flew up, and he landed down, and he was still holding on, but barely. And his whole body was dragging in the water, but he would not let go. He was holding on with all of his might. Well, he wrestled, and we were watching him, and he finally wrestled up and got himself back on. But every girl in the boat started screaming because he got back on, but his shorts didn't make it. He mooned the whole boat, and as we passed by on the shore, all the people on the shore. Man, I would just say this. If things are tough in your life right now, can you have the strength just to hold on in the pit? But remember, it's God who prepares us. So we must be connecting to God in the pit. The other thing is this. God positions us to influence others. All the experiences you have and all the grief that you have, all the victories that you have, God wants to use those to help someone else in your life. Joseph woke up a prisoner that day, but he went to bed a king. And God orchestrated events, Pharaoh's dreams, the cupbearer's memory, and Joseph's interpretation to position him at the right place at the right time. Joseph wasn't just interpreting a dream. God was giving him the authority to help millions of people, and his influence would have a massive ripple effect. Joseph's position didn't just save Egypt, but it extended to the other nations that were around Egypt. And even to his own family. Joseph saved his own family because God put him there to influence others. And remember this, our influence, it starts small. Joseph's influence didn't start big, it started small in the prison. He gained trust with the prison warden there. He's gained trust when he interpreted that small dream in the prison there. So remember, maybe God is giving you a small task right now so that it will help you to be prepared for a bigger task later. God influence only comes through God wisdom. Joseph didn't rely on his own abilities. He pointed to God. Did you see that? I cannot do it, he said, but God will. If you want to have real influence about the things that really matter in life, you got to connect to God. You got to be connecting to the Lord. Now, I don't like using myself as an example all the time. I use myself as an example in the stupid stories. But I did get one right. I got a random text one day from a friend of mine that said that there was a coaching position in Indiana, where I used to live, for the middle school. And I applied for the job, and I wound up getting it. But something amazing happened out of that experience. I didn't go into coaching because I wanted to just win games. I mean, that was definitely part of it. But I wanted to win souls. And so, man, every day I was trying to help those kids connect to the Lord. I mean, I was coaching them hard, and we would get intense, and we would do that. But at the end of the day, I wanted to help them find the Lord. And so, man, I said, hey, guys, I'm going to start a little Bible study in my house, every other week after practice, if you want to come. And so we had 51 players on the team, and 49 of them came. I was calling Pizza Hut. I said, hey, you need to quadruple that order, man. Man, when kids started getting baptized, and other kids started getting baptized, and families started to come to church, and then I was able to have influence in the administration of the school, and then the teachers and the kids. It became a really big influence. But man, it started from something small. Man, I know we all want the big influence. I know we all want the big assignments. But those come after the small ones. If we're faithful in the small things, then God will position us. And lastly, just remember this, that God elevates us for His glory, not our own. Joseph's rise to power wasn't about his success, it was about God's plan to save countless lives. If God has put you in this place, in this time, it is for a reason. I'm reminded of Paul's line in Romans chapter 5, verse 6. He says, you see at just the right time. At just the right time. When we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. When we were still sinners, when we were at the wrong place at the wrong time, Christ died for us. Christ was put into a pit, and 3 days later, He came out. Why? To break our chains. And because of that, He has the keys to unlock your chains. If this morning you woke up as a prisoner to sin, tonight you can go to bed a child of God if you will accept Christ today. You are in the right place at the right time. Let me pray.